Welcome to Sandbox FOMO5 from Bureau Happold. Each week, we pick short snippets from our most recent episode for your listening pleasure. These quick listens could be valuable insights, thought-provoking elements, or even practical advice that will no doubt enrich your life and knowledge.
Human dependence on fossil fuels is relatively recent. It's only really during the course of from around about the 18th century, 19th century onwards, that increasingly industrial culture became more and more dependent on coal. It was coal that fueled the Industrial Revolution. We were increasingly fantasizing, feel like, well, what do we do when the coal runs out? Electricity was very often their answer. Of course, as it turned out, there was oil that powered the 20th century, third or fourth or fifth industrial revolution. And it's that focus on single sources of energy, really, that I think to a large degree has brought us to the interesting place we're at now.
That's a fascinating idea, actually, that we tend to think of the Industrial Revolution. You're there talking about there being 3, 4, or 5. That's absolutely fascinating. And I'll be honest, not a point I've ever considered before. I am particularly excited to have you on the show because you've talked at length in books such as How the Victorians Took Us to the Moon and your online article, Fueling the Future, about the prescience of previous generations. And I'm particularly fascinated by the Nostradamus-like foresight early science fiction writers had in terms of inventing the future, to borrow one of your own phrases. So what really jumps out at you from sci-fi from the past that's proved to be prescient, and what sci-fi that's being written now is perhaps a hopeful future for us from the energy front, Iwan?
One of the really striking things about looking at as a 19th century ideas about the future, and it's during the 19th century that people start thinking about the future in the way that we routinely think about the future, as a destination that we're going to get to through the deployment of new technologies, through the deployment of new sources of energy. The 19th century, of course, it's the century of steam, it's the century of coal. But at the same time, it's astonishing how quickly 19th century commentators start imagining different kinds of future energies within about a decade of the Rainhill trials, for example, when Stephenson's rocket established the future of steam locomotion. You've had people say, oh, no, steam's old hat. The future is going to be electrical, trying to figure out better ways of producing electricity, trying to figure out how to make viable economic electromagnetic locomotives, things like that. They're fantasizing about what other sources of energy are there. And it's very much a kind of imperial fantasy. How will they carry on their world domination? Or increasingly, how might America increase its world domination? There's a really fascinating piece of science fiction, as we would call it, published in 1894 by John Jacob Astor, A Journey in Other Worlds, which kind of fantasizes about a world that's entirely dominated by electricity. He has this fantasy. There'll be a windmill on every house. Rivers will be dammed. There'll be mills to generate electricity in all sorts of ways. It's a kind of vision that seems to us, obviously, wow, fantastic. They were thinking about renewable energy at the end of the 19th century. I think it's important to remember that they weren't actually thinking about renewable energy. What people like Aster were thinking about, why they were so keen on electricity as the future's energy, was that this was going to be infinite. This was going to be indefinite. You could produce as much electricity as you like without there being the kinds of limitation that were increasingly clear in the case of things like coal. You have people like Robert Heinlein with his kind of future history series, imagining sources of power, what we would now think of as kind of solar panels, really, which provide, again, indefinite amounts of energy to fuel this future. If history teaches us anything, I think it teaches us that's not necessarily the good way to think about energetic futures, because one size doesn't fit all, really, I think, when it comes to equitable provision of enough energy for everybody.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that quick dip into our last episode of Sandbox. Don't forget to subscribe to follow the show. You'll find Sandbox in all the usual places. If you want to join the conversation on social media, just use #BHSandbox. We'd love to receive your thoughts or feedback, but also any other subjects you'd like to hear discussed in the future on Sandbox.